So, welcome back to the last talk this morning. Very warm welcome to Curie Virag from the Department of Philosophy at the University of Warwick. And we are now switching from Greece to China, and we will listen to kindness as a virtue in early Confucian ethics. We're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Michael was a tough act to follow. I'll do my best. So, heartfelt thanks to Amber for the invitation and for putting together such an amazing, rich program with scholars and practitioners with really wide-ranging expertise. Thank you to Dominique for the splendid work on the logistical side, and to the Einstein Forum for hosting this event. I just also like to express gratitude for this opportunity to be part of this conversation on this immensely important topic. Given the state of the world today, it's hard to imagine a more urgent topic than kindness, and one that has such far-reaching ramifications for so many people. So to have this chance for us to learn from each other and to pool our collective resources to figure out not only what are the different ways in which the various traditions we study have approached kindness, but also how we might foster it in the world to make it a more hospitable place. So thank you very much. Sorry for missing last night. I had to teach before coming, so I very sadly missed the program. So what does the Confucian tradition have to contribute to our thinking about kindness? What resources does it provide for enhancing our understanding of the value of kindness and the possibilities for realizing it in the world? This is literally the assignment I was given by Amber, and I took it very seriously. So I will be focusing on the early Confucian tradition, by which I'm referring specifically to three texts: the Analects of Confucius, the Mencius, and Xunzi. But in order to explain some important developments in the conceptualization of kindness in early Confucianism, I have to tell you about someone who was actually very much opposed to the Confucians. And this was a figure called Maitrī. Maitrī was the first known major critic of the Confucians. Maitrī and his followers, called the Moists, presented a serious challenge to the Confucians by criticizing the Confucian ethics of partiality and arguing for an ethics of impartiality. So the Moists ended up having a really profound impact in the later development of Confucian thought, and so arguably contributed towards a broadening scope for kindness in the early Confucian tradition. And we will see this when we turn to Mencius. So I want to focus on the early thinkers, because it's really in the early period that we find some major conceptual developments in terms of the ethics of kindness, and also because the early texts reveal some interesting fault lines that highlight what I think are pretty specific conditions for a robust conception of kindness as a virtue. So kindness is extremely interesting topic for discussing the Confucian tradition for several reasons. One is that it immediately opens up a gap in terms of conceptually mapping what it is that we need to attend to, right? We're working across languages, so there's always going to be a gap, not a precise translation. But here I think it also reveals some fascinating features of the Confucian tradition that both limit the importance of kindness, but also points to the distinctive ways in which that tradition can contribute to the fostering of kindness in the contemporary world. So to set things up, I'd like to discuss the early Confucian predicament, which is a world that the Confucius and his followers were confronting when they went about doing and saying the things that they did. So in many ways, the predicament of the early Confucians was much like the one we are facing today. There was a sense that everything is falling apart, the world is in chaos. Confucius, back in the late 6th century BC, was concerned with the practical problem of how to unify and harmonize a world that had been broken apart through conflict, hostility, and war. And this was a predicament that all of the major thinkers of the Warring States period in China attended to, but the Confucians had a distinctive way of trying to solve the problem. And the number one priority for Confucius' followers was to figure out how to address all of this conflict in a way that could foster caring relations and put an end to the war and division, and to create a harmonious social and political order. And Confucius proposed that it was by harmonizing relations at the interpersonal level that we can create the foundations of an orderly world at the societal level. And here are the concentric circles. I didn't fill in the blank, but you can imagine just what Michael said. So what does all of this mean for kindness? So despite the background that I've just been outlining, kindness was not something that emerged as a prominent theme in Confucian writings. I've no doubt that the early Confucians valued kindness, that they regarded kindness as an important human quality. And so to this extent, they took being kind as a feature of what it meant to be a fully realized human being. So it would be fair to describe kindness as a virtue in the for the early Confucians. But I think it's important to acknowledge that kindness was not thematized in the sense that it was a primary or defining virtue among the early Confucians. There was no broad injunction to be loving and kind. Kindness was rather a concomitant of fulfilling one's humanity, which involved considerations of fittingness and righteousness. And this distinction, I think, is really important because it points to a feature of Confucian ethics that needs to be considered in order to appreciate the conceptual role and significance of kindness within that tradition. And that is the emphasis on the procedural aspects of our personal and collective existence. So the proposed solution for making the world right was not to encourage people to be kind to each other. Instead, it was to create a world in which loving relations could flourish. So to achieve this, we need to bring about a social and political order based on the proper civilizing patterns that could guide our actions, but also make possible the full and proper realization of our feelings. And this word "wen" for pattern, it was ultimately derived from patterns in the natural world. So it wasn't simply a human invention, although the Confucians were very much aware that human invention and ingenuity was necessary. But the patterns were really sort of, like the patterns that you find in a piece of marble, right? That these patterns were natural, and because they're natural, they do provide some kind of normative grounding for humans as well. So there is a connection to how things are in the broader natural world. But for the Confucians, the patterns that should guide human life included things like ritual, music, comportment, how we dress, all of these activities by which we order our existence and by which we express who we are and what matters to us. So to this extent, kindness in a robust sense, implied by the modern term and by the Buddhist idea of maitrī, was not a virtue among the early Confucians. But despite all this, I want to propose that the early Confucian tradition does provide significant resources for us today in terms of understanding and fostering kindness. And one of the most important resources is ritual. So I think what the Confucians understood and appreciated was the power and beauty of ceremonial practice, however mundane, to transform relationships and connect people to each other. So this isn't the first thing that comes to mind when people think about Confucian ritual. It is, in terms of what was valued, in terms of how it was practiced, it was very hierarchical, right? It was very much about social order. But I think it has the most important elements of ritual can be sort of adapted to our context. And the most important thing was the ability of ritual to foster loving relations among people. And that could provide a compelling direction, right, for transforming social life. So this is my proposal in a nutshell. I just like to flesh this out under sort of 3 broad headings. So the first is just looking at some passages, looking at how kindness, what we might understand as kindness, was conceptualized in the early Confucian texts. So how did these texts discuss those feelings and acts of caring that are involved in kindness, and to what extent might we understand these discussions as kindness in the robust sense. Second is the role and importance of kindness in the conception of the virtuous human agent. And thirdly, ritual as a vehicle for cultivating kindness. So I guess we should begin with what is kindness. And since this is this event is inspired by the Buddhist notion of loving kindness, I thought that's going to be the guideline. So if you don't really know anything, you go to the dictionary. And so I did that. And Oxford Dictionary of Buddhism. So the various features that have been highlighted here, right? I think if we sort of pull these various strands together from this definition, there are a few key points that I think comprise a robust notion of kindness. One is the importance of the affective charge, right? Because the word itself is kind of ambiguous. So we need some form of love that is tinged with a genuine concern for the well-being of others. It also involves benevolent action, and that action is concerned with the flourishing of others. And third, that these feelings and actions extend to all living beings beyond one's particular ties. So I think this is something shared with the Christian tradition, which I have a lot of personal experience with, but I feel like that kind of injunction, right, to be loving and kind is so important in the Christian tradition. So I sense that that's the case also with the tradition, the Buddhist tradition that we're working with. So I'd like to claim that these are components of a robust conception of kindness, and that in view of these aspects, I'd just like to make a couple of observations that will be relevant for the issues that I'll be talking about in the Confucian tradition. So one is the semantic expansiveness of kindness. So it involves a kind of spectrum or a very complex terrain that extends from feeling to action. So while it involves fellow feeling or love for others, it also refers to a certain quality of action. So we can speak of kind actions, acts that benefit others or help them to flourish. There's also kindness conceived as being socially inclusive and tending towards universalism, so extending beyond particularistic ties. And these aspects are linked to some tensions or ambiguities that I think are embedded in kindness as a concept that will be relevant for the early Confucian texts. One tension is between feeling and action. So concern for the flourishing of others or action that benefits others. There is a way in which these can come apart, and in some of the texts I think we do have a kind of unsatisfactory delimitation of what kind of kindness is relevant. And then the second tension is this between partial caring and impartial caring, right, which kind of came up already in the end of Michael's Q&A. So, all right, having laid this out, I'd like to turn to the early Confucian texts. So I'm just putting some terms there that I think are the relevant terms to discuss when we are looking at the early Confucian texts. And so the main contenders, I think, are these 4. The first is Ren, which is often translated as humaneness or benevolence. You can see humaneness is more about a quality of character, benevolence is more about kind of benefiting others, right? So it's more action-oriented. Humaneness was the quintessential Confucian virtue. Right? The best thing that you could become was to be a person of Ren. So there's also this word I, which is a general term for love, but it also refers to concern, care for others. A term which refers to, is probably the first term that you think of when you think of kindness, but it's a kind of paternalistic, right? So the paternalistic forms of kindness often use this term "en," right? Conferring favor to others or benefiting others. And then "zi" also, it has a more affective charge to it. It's about compassion, mercy, and it's also often in the paternalistic context. So not all of these terms appear in all of these works. They don't all have the same meaning, and the meanings shift and so on. But I think those four cover a pretty significant part of what I think is relevant for our discussion. And it also, they also allow us to track some important developments through the thinkers that we'll be looking at. So, but tracking these terms doesn't necessarily tell us what we need to know, because in order to see if there was a robust notion of kindness as a kind of ethical imperative, we also need to know how important kindness was within a broader notion of the ideal agent, right, or the fully realized person. So that's the second question, right? How central was kindness to the conception of the virtuous agent? And so if we turn to the robust conception of kindness that I mentioned earlier, I would say that while kindness was understood as a trait of the virtuous or ideal agent, it was significantly circumscribed by various other concerns, as well as by the Confucian emphasis on particularistic ties. But we do see a development towards a more universal orientation. So let me now turn to the text. So Confucius, the founding figure of this tradition that was named after him, he has various injunctions to care about others, which I think are also injunctions to be kind to others. One such injunction appears in the context of sort of what a proper ruler should do, right? So there's an exhortation to rulers to love people. So the master said, to guide a state of 1,000 chariots, be respectful in your handling of affairs and display trustworthiness, be frugal in your expenditures, and cherish or love others, and employ the common people only at the right times. There is another more general injunction for ordinary person. A youth should overflow in love to all and cultivate the friendship of the good. Right, so that's what you see in this passage. Now in a third passage, and this is a really important one because it's about humaneness, which I mentioned was the quintessential Confucian virtue. Humaneness. So Confucius, there are many passages in the Analects in which students go up to him and ask him, "What do you mean by humaneness?" And that's a really interesting thing. First of all, because every time someone asks him that question, he gives them a different answer. Mm-hmm. And the second one is he must be doing something really unusual for them to be constantly asking, "What on earth are you talking about?" And so he did represent a really significant shift in understanding this term. It becomes an ethical, morally charged term. So Fancher, one of his disciples, asked about humaneness. The master said, care for others, and was translated as care. It's this term I that I referred to as love earlier. He then asked about knowledge. The master said, know others. So things are looking pretty promising. Now, as far as this term ren, humaneness, is concerned, in another passage, when his disciple Yanwen asked how to become ren, this is what Confucius tells him. Do not look unless it is in accordance with ritual propriety. Do not listen unless it is in accordance with ritual propriety. Do not speak unless it is in accordance with ritual propriety. Do not move unless it is in accordance with ritual propriety. So there are quite a few things that are being pulled together here, right? So Ren is a very complex virtue that has different dimensions. Loving others is one facet of it, but doing the correct thing, the fitting and appropriate thing at any given moment, that's also what it means to be a person of Ren. So the ritual is very, very central to this. There's also the fact that caring for others involves taking responsibility for the proper development and instruction of others. So there is also a kind of paternalistic concern, right, with educating other people, making sure that people are doing the right thing. So the master said, if you really care for others, can you then fail to put them to work? If you're really dutiful to someone, can you then fail to instruct them? So if we consider Confucius's ideal agent more generally, I don't think that we can say that the injunction to exhibit loving kindness was necessarily central. What was central was living the right way, doing the right thing. So if you're a ruler, you should take care of the people, but being kind was just one part of your job, right? It wasn't an overarching injunction. If you're anyone else who wishes to cultivate yourself, you should be evaluating and judging people according to what is right and helping them on the path to becoming a virtuous person. And this emphasis on judgment also meant that one could justifiably have contempt for people. I have a whole essay on contempt in Confucius and Xunzi, so there's a lot of material about contempt. So there is this really interesting passage. The master said, only the humane person can love people and despise them. Now this is a funny passage because the term "u," so what's translated here is despise. It means usually to hate, but I think that wouldn't quite work because it wouldn't make sense that only the humane person hates and loves people, right? We're all able to do that, so surely it's not the right way to take it. So this only suggests that he's talking about loving and hating people appropriately, right? So loving appropriately in the right way and hating appropriately in the right way. And this is clearly a judgment about the qualities of the target of these appraisals, right? And it's about the aptness of the evaluation. So the point is that the humane person, this person of Ren, has contempt for things that are worthy of contempt and love for things that are worthy of love. So it's about having the ability to respond appropriately, and that's something that one can do only if one has cultivated oneself. In another passage, does the gentleman have those that he has contempt for? The master replied, yes, he does. He has contempt for those who pronounce the bad points of others, contempt for those who remain below while criticizing those above, contempt for those who are bold yet lack propriety, contempt for those who are plucky yet violent. So all of this judgment suggests that Confucius doesn't really regard kindness or loving care as a general imperative that should be extended universally. The virtuous person, the person of Ren, is one who is concerned with evaluating others, with rightness, and with doing the right thing. And so all of this seems to militate against a broad ethic of kindness towards everyone. And so kindness should be practiced, but was part of a more hefty package of ethical demands that involve right understanding, right judgment, right action. And in general, the Confucian understanding of the affective community was one that prioritized particularistic ties, right? Those with whom one was connected personally, one's family, one's friends, one's superiors and subordinates, people with whom one had established relationships. And I mentioned earlier, these concentric circles. In theory, sometimes they would refer to, all under heaven, right? You kind of extend this affection towards all under heaven, but I don't think it was, it can be really sustained by the rest of the ethical framework. Now, I mentioned that we need to talk about Mozi. There's some really interesting developments from Confucius to Mencius, and Mozi sort of inserts himself in that transition. So Mozi was the first major critic of Confucius. As I mentioned, he's very critical of the Confucian emphasis on particularistic ties. According to Mozi, this is the whole reason why the world is such a mess. People only care about their own, right? And they're willing to kill each other. Number one devotion was towards oneself. So there's also conflict even within the family, right? But then it's sort of families against families, states against states. So we need to stop this, right? And so his proposal is his doctrine of impartial caring, jian ai. So he proposed that we should care about the plight of all people, irrespective of their personal connections to us. And so he introduces a significant consideration that is completely off the radar in the Confucian account, which is this criterion of universality, right, in how we treat one another. So he launches a major critique against his contemporaries for not caring about those beyond their personal communities and for exclusively embracing those within their familial and personal networks, and failing to really understand that we have moral obligations to people beyond those that we know. So in advocating that it's this larger community that represents the proper domain of our concern, Mozi gives voice to the idea of the human being as a universal category, and this also opens the idea for a more general injunction to treat people, all people, with kindness. And it stuns me, right, that back in 5th century BC, he could have come up with such an idea. But I think it does have to do with the fact that he was kind of a social reformer, right? He was not one of these elites. He was educated in this kind of the type of system that Confucius had access to. And maybe that gave him a kind of compassion that provided the resources to think that, well, at the end of the day, we all are connected because we are human. So he was able to imagine that. But the affective content of his notion of impartial caring was pretty limited. It's about taking care of the people, taking care of their needs. It's not necessarily about sort of loving kindness, but I think the ground was laid for at least an ideal of concern for the well-being of all people. And this is an idea that Mencius takes on board, even while criticizing the Moists. So Mencius, he's most widely known as a thinker who proposed that all human beings have an inborn sprout of compassion, and that this sprout, if cultivated and allowed to develop in hospitable circumstances, would become developed into full-fledged humaneness. But this was an argument for the claim that human morality had a biological source, rather than part of an ethics that prioritized kindness as a general virtue to develop. And in fact, Mencius emphasized, in direct opposition to the Moists, that differentiated treatment of people, right, partiality of feelings, was simply natural, and that any attempt to impose a kind of across-the-board injunction to love everyone equally was to deny natural human feelings. Now, there's something a little bit sneaky about this move, because it isn't clear that the Moists were saying that everyone should be loved equally. That would be crazy, right? I don't think he was crazy. He was just very systematic and programmatic. So it's not even plausible that he was talking about love in a robust sense. But anyway, he gets attacked for this for the next 2,000 years. And Mencius builds on Mozi's injunction to extend our caring and kindness from those that we already naturally care about to those we have nothing to do with. But for Mencius, right, this is an injunction that applies to rulers. So he doesn't extend it to all people. And I guess that's connected to a point that Michael made about sort of the difference between the sagely perspective and the more ordinary perspective. The king is supposed to be someone who occupies a kind of sagely position in terms of being able to access more. The demand then is for rulers. Mencius is in conversation with rulers, trying to get them to behave virtuously, not always successfully. One of the interesting passages in which an exchange takes place between Mencius and a king that he's trying to convert is in passage 1a7. He meets King Xuan of the state of Qi, and he's trying to persuade the king that he has what it takes to be a virtuous ruler. So the king said, "What must one's virtue be like so that one can become king?" Mencius says, "One takes care of the people and becomes king. This is something no one can stop." The king said, "Can one such as ourselves care for the people?" Mencius says, "Sure you can." The king said, how do you know that we can?" Mencius said, "I heard this story about you." Okay, this is the story. He had heard the attendant Hu He, pass on the story. While the king was sitting up in his hall, an ox was led past below. The king saw it and said, "Where's the ox going?" Hu He replied, "We are about to ritually anoint a bell with its blood." The king said, "Spare it. I cannot bear its frightened appearance, like an innocent going to the execution ground." Hu He replied, "So should we dispense with the anointing of the bell?" The king said, "How can that be dispensed with? Exchange it for a sheep." So the people hear this story and they're kind of outraged, right? A life is a life after all. So the conclusion was like the king was a cheapskate. There's no virtue whatsoever in sparing the ox just to kill the sheep, right? But Mencius, he says, this tells me something. This shows me that you have compassion. And so he says, "You saw the ox, but had not seen the sheep. Gentlemen cannot bear to see animals die if they have seen them living. If they hear their cries of suffering, they cannot bear to eat their flesh. Hence, gentlemen keep their distance from them." I don't even want to go there trying to justify it. Super problematic, but in any case, we just ignore that. So he says, but Mencius concludes from this, in the present case, your kindness is sufficient to reach animals. So he knows that he's got that kindness. But the problem is that the effects do not reach the commoners. He's not taking care of the people. So hence, if one extends one's kindness, and this idea of extension is a Moist technical term, right? Steals it from the Moist. If one extends one's kindness, it will be sufficient to care for all within the 4 Cs. So we see that kindness is an injunction for rulers. It's connected with winning the hearts of the people, so it's good political strategy. So I think that's part of the thing that Mencius is trying to persuade the ruler with. But it's really about taking care of the people and their needs. It's not really a more general humanistic concern for their flourishing as such. So the affective charge is pretty limited, right? And it's not a general injunction for people. And we can see this in the way that Mencius engages in an ongoing debate with the followers of Mozi, right? And his position is really firmly in favor of differentiated particularistic love, which seems a clear barrier to a more universalistic notion, even if Mencius thinks that we should extend our love to everyone. So on Mozi's impartial caring, Mencius's comment is, "This is to not have a father. To not have a father and to not have a ruler is to be an animal." So that's his view. So he supports an account of differentiated treatment of others. So Mencius said, "Gentlemen in relation to animals are sparing of them, but are not benevolent towards them. In relation to the people, they're benevolent towards them, but do not treat them as kin. They treat their kin as kin, and then are benevolent toward the people. They're benevolent toward the people, and then are sparing of animals." So I think he just assumes that it'll somehow naturally sort of trickle, right? And leaves it at that, right? So there is a broad value of being benevolent towards the people, but again, not quite the affective charge of loving kindness, and there is no injunction towards kindness or even benevolence towards all people. And finally, we have this slide. Mencius said, "The wise understand everything, but they are most concerned about what is their responsibility. The benevolent love everyone, but they take as a responsibility being concerned about the worthy. The wisdom of Yao and Shun, the ancient sage rulers, was not universal. They were concerned about what was their primary responsibility. The benevolence of Yao and Shun did not love everyone. They were most concerned about the worthy." So it's really interesting, right? This kind of preoccupation with responsibility, with right judgment and assessment. So all of that is connected to the justification of the differentiated treatment of other people. All right, so finally we have Xunzi, and just out of interest of time, I just very briefly discuss Xunzi's way of addressing this issue. Xunzi is very much a statecraft thinker. By the time Xunzi comes around, You have very centralized states, and Xunzi is there giving counsel to rulers, and so he brings up the importance of having loving concern in a few passages. One is in the context of the ruler, right? So the true ruler is one who has loving concern for the people. So that seems to be, at this point, pretty general injunction. Everyone should care for the people. But he also has a passage about concern for others as a feature of the virtuous person, more generally. So the heart, yes. So the heart that can make the whole world submit is one wherein, if the person occupies a high position or is honored and noble, he does not use these to treat others arrogantly. If he is brilliant or has sagely wisdom, he does not use these to reduce others to dire straits. There are none for whom he does not feel concern. There are none to whom he does not show respect. On no occasion does he contend with others, but he is broad and open, just like the way heaven and earth encompass the myriad things. If one is like this, then those who are worthy will honor you, and even those who are unworthy will favor you. When one is like this, those who still do not submit, okay, this is where it gets really bad, can be called unnatural and devious men. Even if they happen to be among your sons or younger brothers, it is fitting for them to suffer punishment. So you can see this is part of a very broad package of qualities that are ultimately meant to characterize someone who is in a position of some authority, right, and has the charismatic power to transform people, right, but also someone who has the power to punish people who aren't going to kind of live up to your expectations and abide by what you think are kind of guidelines for proper action. So finally, I want to talk about ritual as a vehicle for fostering and cultivating kindness. So the Confucians were ultimately primarily concerned with what it means to be a great human, right? How to bring order to the world. So in this sense, loving kindness was a kind of subsidiary value. It was an important quality of the fully realized person, but it was a concomitant of virtue, right? Not a main priority. But I think that the fact that loving kindness was not a central priority for the early Confucians is a separate issue from whether the tradition offers resources for fostering kindness. So I think if we care about fostering it, we can legitimately draw from aspects of this tradition that might be compelling for us to take on board. And there is something, I think, and that is ritual. So a shared basic assumption about the early Confucian tradition is that a human being is not a natural category. A human being is a potentiality for realization. So we are not born human, we become human. That has all sorts of really interesting metaphysical implications and ethical implications, right? And we become human through the practice of ritual. So the practice of ritual, which comes with all sorts of constraints, right? That is actually a vehicle that allows the kind of encounters to take place. And so there are these humanizing effects of ritual that I think that we can build on in order to draw some resources. So I mentioned earlier in my talk the power and beauty of ceremonial practice to transform relationships and connect people to each other. And we're not necessarily talking about grand ceremony, although of course, royal ceremonies are a very important dimension of ritual. But it also includes very basic, mundane, everyday things like greeting each other, right? Having a conversation, celebrating the milestones of life, sharing a meal together. So it includes a whole spectrum of activities that are appropriate to both near, in your engagement with people who are both near and far. And each has a kind of unspoken protocol, right? So not necessarily in terms of strict rules, but in terms of there being appropriate and beautiful forms of conduct. And so insofar as they create opportunities for engagement with others, irrespective of who they are, these kinds of, these modes of contact acknowledge the presence and dignity of the other and evoke reciprocal acts of respect and care. And through this face-to-face personal engagement comes the realization of one's own humanity and the recognition of the humanity of others. So we not only see them as human, but also engage with them. Right? So for the Confucians, love is something that arises naturally from seeing another as human, and so linked together with us in a shared bond as part of a common membership in a community. Now for Mencius, this was manifested in an inability to bear the distress of others, and that we were bound together biologically. But Xunzi argued that this was something to be fostered by ritual practice. So there is a very important book on Confucian ritual. Interestingly, it was written by a non-expert of Chinese thought. It was Herbert Fingeret, who's a philosopher of law and ethics, among other things. Didn't know Chinese, didn't know anything about China, picked up a copy of the Analects and just browsed through it and first thought, what on earth is this? He returned to it and then he realized, wow, there's something here. And this is, so his way of bringing back to life the importance of ritual has been profoundly influential on the study of the Analects in modern scholarship. So in one of the passages about ritual, Fingeret writes, rite brings out forcefully not only the harmony and beauty of social forms, the inherent and ultimate dignity of human intercourse, it brings out also the moral perfection implicit in achieving one's ends by dealing with others as beings of equal dignity, as free co-participants in li, or ritual. Furthermore, to act by ceremony is to be completely open to the other, for ceremony is public, shared, transparent. It is in this beautiful and dignified, shared and open participation with others where ultimately, like oneself, that man and woman realizes himself and herself. So ritual enables us to become fully human by creating opportunities for mutual recognition. And this not only binds us to the community around us, but also makes it possible for us as individuals to inhabit the world and to be at home in it. And this being at home in the community is the starting point for love and thus also of kindness. So, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have a first question by Dominic.
It's not really a question, just a really brief comment. When I came to Germany as an American, I was really taken aback or affected by the fact that when toasts were given, you had to look everyone in the eye, right, before you drank your wine or your beer. Or in the East German tradition, you'd come into a room, you'd shake everyone's hand, right, like at a birthday party. It seemed crazy to me. But it really, I have to say, coming from a world where that didn't exist, the US came to seem kind of barbaric, because that sort of connection, even though it was a very small gesture, really seemed to make a difference in how I felt about the people I was hanging out with.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and I mean, Confucius was really onto something, right? And, you know, you go into a room, if you don't engage in this basic act of courtesy, you have no contact with them. They're just sort of your environment, right? And just that really simple gesture, you know, you're not going to be lifelong friends with them. You have this moment in time and you connect and, you know, you give as much as you can in that, you know, in the space of that opportunity. But yeah, I think that's a starting point for just humanizing the world a bit. So yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Ben.
So I had a question about the translation of the word I. Okay. Which, of course, now is used for romantic love as well. Yeah. And you use some other cognate terms for kindness. Yeah. What is the range that's available for that word in ancient philosophy? And are there continuities, and when is it adjusted?
Yes, I mean, even in just in the Warring States period, there is a pretty wide range. And it's true that right, in modern Chinese, it's about romantic love, it's about passion, but I mean, it's pretty clear that in many of these contexts, it's about affection and caring, right? So not necessarily this kind of passionate love. So the ox passage where Mencius, right? Mencius says, "Spare the ox," and then they refer to sparing the ox, and Mencius says, "You spared the ox," and when he says that, it's I. So it's like you love the ox. So yeah, it's got quite a range. I think, and I guess I'm just assuming that robust kindness is something that includes love of some sort, right? So in a way, it captures the spectrum of affective, connections.
Vor Ben, neben Michael. Yeah.
I really liked your talk. Thank you. There's clearly so much insight that Confucius has. My question is, to what extent could ceremonial action be considered reverent and thus respectful and thus kind? In a way, how much can we collapse the difference between ceremony and kindness? Because if I'm reverent towards you, that implies respect. And if I respect you, that's like akin to love in a deep way. That says I honor you as well. Yeah. And it reminded me of what Xunzi, the story there.
Yeah. So was it? Sorry. Was it, the question was? Is it more about sort of the expanded range of love once you bring the respect into the picture? I'm trying to sort of get the thrust of your comment or question. Yeah.
Sure. Yes. So Confucius, in making ceremony so important, made me see that there's less distinction between. Originally, I thought ceremony was something separate than a kindness.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, like, if I do someone a kindness, that's not ceremonial. But now that I think about it, ceremony has so much inside it. There's respect there.
Yeah.
And if I respect you, I'm kind to you.
Yeah.
In a way. So to what extent can we collapse the difference into it being kind?
Yeah. I guess we don't want to collapse it by sort of under a modern conception of kindness and love. It's more an opportunity to expand how we understand kindness and love, right? That to respect someone is a very important form of love. And maybe that's something we don't normally think about in our kind of post-romantic era of romantic love, right? And the opposite, I was talking about contempt, right? So one of the ways in which you can have contempt for someone is not this active, like, I hate you and I despise you, but just to ignore them. They say you have a colleague that you don't like, you're both at a conference, your colleague walks in and you don't look at them. That's an act of contempt, right? It's not emotionally charged, but it's disrespect, it's disregarding them. So I think, it's very instructive, it's very helpful to think about how, the wide spectrum, right, that is covered by our affective lives, and it's not just about this kind of emotionally charged states. So I really appreciate your paying attention to that, kind of the implications for conceptualizing love and kindness. Thank you.
Carola Roloff.
Yeah, thank you very much for this illuminating talk. I'm struggling with the word harmony. So what is really meant by harmony? Because my impression in dialogue with Asian Buddhism is somehow that harmony means also to respect hierarchy. And if you question the hierarchy, then there is the risk of disharmony, which they try to avoid. So I wonder whether this has its roots in Confucianism, and a second question is whether you know about the humanistic Buddhist approach from the Fokwangshan organization in Taiwan. It's a huge Buddhist organization, and they propagate this term humanist Buddhism. And so I wonder whether this has also a link or not, and I don't know whether you know about it.
Well, okay, thank you very much. Yeah, it's really a big, important question. If you look at the Analects, there actually isn't that much about harmony, right? But this is what we imagine, like Confucian tradition. It's about sort of harmonizing people, and I think harmony becomes really important from around the time of Xunzi, actually, because Xunzi talks a lot about how ritual is a vehicle for harmonizing people, and I think for him, it's very much part of this. Creating a structure through which everything becomes ordered, everyone's place in society, place within the hierarchy. It's a bit scary, right? So it's really top down. I don't even there, he kind of posits that this will lead to harmonious society, but a really kind of deep inquiry into harmony, I think we see it as we move very close to empire. And there we have really interesting combinations of sort of Taoist and Confucian ideas. And there's this notion of cosmic resonance, right? This idea, and it's bound up with the creation of empire. The whole argument for empire is that we're all human beings. Actually, we're all the same, right? And so all of the disparate things in the cosmos are connected through this resonance. So there are we can organize everything into different categories and kinds, and things resonate across categories. And so that's where we see, in this imperial context, this idea of resonance across time and space. And of course, the development of that whole tradition, I think, becomes really marks the later discussions of ethics. So the Taiwanese version, Buddhist version, I think is a kind of drawing from all of those traditions. But I find really in the early text, harmony, in Confucius, that's not really a prominent topic. Yeah, I feel it's really humanistic. It's less emphasis. It is definitely hierarchical, right? It's kind of like with Aristotle. Like, you have to bracket all this awful stuff, right? But there is some good stuff, and so let's just take the good stuff and not the bad stuff. I think we can do that. Yeah.
Okay, since we are approaching lunch break, but we have 4 more questions, I'm going to start to bundle 2, if that's okay. Yeah. So next 2 is Michael Griffin, and then Alexis Shotwell.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the beautifully illuminating talk. And I have a quick question about the pedagogy of virtue and ritual. Thinking of Greek points of comparison, maybe one sort of pedagogical notion would be that you have to start with precepts that you gradually habituate by doing them over and over again without understanding them, and then later you understand them and they become more robust and resistant to manipulation and interference, and finally you just follow them effortlessly, or at least that would be the ideal. And I wondered if that sort of cultivation, is that present in these traditions? Do they disagree with each other? That was my question.
Yeah, we can talk all day about this.
Thank you.
There's I think passage 2:4.
Wait. Let's just talk.
Sorry, I was so excited by your question.
So it's a similar question actually about the. I loved really this transit point between thinking about nature as normative to thinking about ritual as normative, and especially through that moment of what happens in anointing the bell and with whom. So, like, where do you have this? this shift from the nature as normative to the ritual as normative as maybe a site of pedagogical space, but yeah.
Yeah, great. So there's a whole body of scholarship about that kind of connects Confucianism with virtue ethics, but it's so clear that the parallels. So there's a passage in the Analects, I think it's 2:4. It's sort of Confucius's one-line autobiography. So when I was 15, I set my heart on learning. When I was 30, I took my stand. When I was 40, I don't remember all the steps. When I was 70, I could follow my heart's content and never cross the line. I mean, how wonderful is that, right? You do whatever you want, and it's always the right thing. So this kind of, mastery, that idea, we find also in the Taoist tradition, right? So virtuosity as the endpoint of ethical cultivation. So the transition from the kind of natural concept, there's really interesting things there. So the term "wen," right, which is about like natural patterns, before it became so it actually did become the term for literature and writing, but in the middle, right, it's sort of how a person is, right? So the transition is one where it's more close to, I think, to the kinds of patterns that emerge in human interaction, right? What happens when people come together? And the term "ren," humaneness, the character, it's the human radical on the left side, and then it's two. So human and two people. And that's the beginning of humanity and humaneness. So, yeah. More to say about that. But
Okay, we have the last two questions. First Kilian Jörg and then Christian Suhr.
Hi, thanks a lot for this. I hope I'm clear. I'm still coming down from a migraine, but I'm still trying because I found it really fascinating. And it's kind of a remark which leads to a question, because I was really fascinated by your quote that the humane can love and hate appropriately. And this really kind of was in harmony with a fascination that I more act out in my artistic work than my theoretical work, which is inspired by this kind of unknown work by Georges Bataille, La Part Maudite, the accursed chair, in which his analysis very briefly is that the problem of Christian capitalist society is that it has unlearned a place for the destructive negative forces. So he's kind of saying every other civilization also has ritualistic spaces for negative forces, and purist Christian and then capitalist society kind of tries to put that out. So to put this in a simple example, in so-called Hinduist tradition, there's Shiva, and it's a god, we venerate him, and the Satan is really somebody you want to keep out. It's not somebody you venerate in a way. And I think this is quite telling for maybe what could be understood as a problem of secular Christian society, because Bataille's analysis would be that the destructive forces really come out nasty if we don't have put them on some pedestal in a way. And this leads me to my question of the term Ren, the human, because so I'm really a layperson in Chinese philosophy, so I learned the most from François Julian, who I know is very contested in your field. So pardon me if that's a bit lay. But I learned from him that only the Chinese and the European culture has actually brought forth a term as universalist as the humane, or as the Ren, which kind of encompasses everything we call human in English. And I found it quite interesting because as a post-humanist, a lot of kind of alarm bells, ring with like, you can become human, you can't, because, a lot of colonial violence was legitimized by it. And so I was wondering, what are the fine differences between the Ren and the human, which might not fall into the same pits as, let's say, humanity.
Okay.
Wow.
Okay. Wait. Christian Suhr.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It's such a blessing to be allowed to get these deep sort of introductions to traditions that I don't know anything about, both before and now this. And in this presentation, one thing I really enjoyed was there were these few comments, like for example when you talked about the kind of punishment that could be done to people who didn't obey the perfect person or perfect ruler, and you kind of had this sort of gesture of sarcasm or irony when talking about that. Also at some point you added like men and women, and you also made a comparison, I think, in the previous comment to Greek philosophy, something about the extension of love and kindness, and so for me, I think those are important moments where there's space for cultural criticism, and which is, I think, also important when thinking about kindness, how kindness might also necessarily also include a space for criticism, and then you said there was really, I don't remember, you said something like there's really something awkward here, but there's also some good stuff, and we can take that. So I'm just curious, who is we, and I'm curious about where in what does this good stuff become included, or when you take it and you put it into something that we can, and yeah, I'm just interested in what we do with this collecting.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Wow, such thoughtful questions. I think I'm going to have to sort of cherry pick, or it's also my memory problem. So just on then maybe we can discuss the rest of the stuff during the meal. But yeah, all the negative affect, right, that are sort of brushed under the carpet. I think it's absolutely right. And I mean, another topic I've been working on recently is anger, right, and how much we, as I guess Western civilization has moved away from the possibility of legitimate display of anger. And I think, as you can expect, the Confucians were very like, pro-anger, you know? A sage is appropriately angry, right? And so the idea that you should somehow not be angry, I mean, it didn't make sense, because if your anger is a reflection of the reality that you are in. And so if you're going to do something about that anger is your confrontation. It's the embodiment of that reality that is problematic. So I agree with you that I think we need to kind of recognize what is being recognized in other religious traditions. So I'll just kind of leave it at that for now. Yeah, who are the we and what do we want to do? I think there's so many difficulties that people have, especially people living in modern world, who have no anchor in the world, right? I mean, who, like global academics, right? Artists. I mean, we're traveling around, living in community for a while. We live in some other community for a while. We move. I'm living in my 5th country right now, right? And so it's very hard, I think, to have connection. And I see this among my students too. Everyone, they're just kind of living, floating around. And, just like being able to stop and pay attention and engage with each other, stop looking at the phone, just like have a little conversation, and they're afraid to do that because they don't know how to do it. They would look at their phone if they have a moment where they're alone and they don't want to be seen alone. So this kind of thing, I think I think that's a real problem. It's an objective problem of lack of connection. So I feel that ritual, it makes things really easy, actually. You don't have to come up with something really new. You just have to say hi to that person. You just have a coffee, or just acknowledge, and very ordinary activities that do have a protocol, right? And it's liberating to have protocol. Xunzi writes very eloquently about funerary rites, which I wrote an essay about that. I've written a few things about that. But the last thing you want to do when someone you love dies is to try and figure out what you should do. You know, if you've got these prescriptions to follow, right, and you just, that is the ultimate stability, right? So I think we all need some more stability, and many of the difficulties that we're having as a society is that we don't have these anchors anymore. We just think that we're all free agents and we can just keep floating around, but I don't think humans can really, we're not built for that. We're built for connection, and we're built for like living in the real world with real objects, and yeah, so I feel that these are the kinds of things that the early Confucian tradition can offer. My students have been extremely receptive. Actually, when I teach the Analects, first week of my early Chinese philosophy module, by second week, they're all hardcore Confucian. So there's clearly a need, I think, and a kind of a hunger for stability. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. First of all, please join me in thanking Curie Virag.